Hello, hi everyone, Kelvin here from London. Going to do a thing today about the vintage sound. What is the vintage sound if you're not familiar? It's not super easy to explain, but I think I'm on top of it. That vintage era, the 70s, early 80s, let's say. I was on fire about hi-fi in that time. I was listening to everything I could, testing. I was really quite a fanatic in those days. So I should know about those things. But so we have this question: what's the vintage sound? And point to know is not everything that is vintage that is from that period is good and delivers that vintage sound. That's kind of, it's the first thing you want to know. But let's have a look at these three things here, and these will be quite good at bringing things into perspective. So, all made in Japan, yeah. All essentially you would call vintage receivers, yeah. So Sansui 331, low power, only I think 12 watts. Not a problem for the vintage sound, mostly because in the vintage world particularly was synonymous with sensitive speakers, yeah? So speakers that didn't need a lot of driving and speakers that may be quite big. So, I could plug this into a pair of vintage speakers in any room and probably impress you with the welly, even that, this more, and this even more. But it's not like this would sound anemic, because the whole thing about the vintage sound was to make this sort of full-bodied, comforting, warm, whatever you want to call it. We'll go into detail about that in a minute. Anyway, sorry, let me go back here. So yeah, Sansui 331, classic vintage sound. When we talk vintage, most times we're talking Japanese, yeah? We're talking the good-looking, silver, loads of buttons, you know what I mean? Lights up, looks fantastic, So that's mostly what I'm talking about vintage. I mean, you could call, other things going on like NAD and Quad and, quality companies working away in the background, still delivering good quality stuff, But this is the mainstream stuff, the good looking stuff. And, some of these things still go for not a lot of money and they sound pretty good. It does not stop surprising me when I get old bits of vintage kit. I look at it and I think, oh, well, this isn't going to sound that good, But if I give it feed it with some nice sauce, 9 times out of 10, I'm going, oh, wow, it's normally surprising me. That Sony surprised me in particular. We'll get to this in a sec. Or I'll do a separate review of that too. But anyway, let me continue. This Sony, only 25 watts. It's got loads of power. It's got capacity for 3 sets of speakers, I mean, again, if you plug this in, you'd be amazed how beefy it and, robust and, big, solid, grippy, in the room, lively sound. That's the vintage sound, yeah? Now, one way I thought to articulate what the vintage sound is, it's like people have designed an amplifier. I'm talking about amp sound here mostly today, by the way. I'll talk about speakers, but mostly about the amplifier side of it all. But what it is, the vintage sound, it's like someone said, okay, we're designing a hi-fi for people's front rooms, and we want them to get hold of everything in that front room. So we might tweak things a little bit. Yeah, I'm not saying that's what they did, but one of the the things that really you notice, say with this Sony, any of this or this, these three here, you won't be felt wanting. There won't be anemic bass. There won't be lack of bass. There won't be lack of, the sounds are a little bit bigger. Yeah. This is one thing that happens when you get into the sort of 80s and 90s, or maybe all the way up to this day, to be honest, is that in the attempt to get greater accuracy and get your distortion figures down to 0.001, things kind of get a little bit more delicate and precise, but kind of smaller. Yeah. So the vintage sound, you would call it, it's robust, it's in the room, and it's big, and sort of most of the sounds, whatever, in any song, they're kind of there it doesn't get all teeny and delicate and leave you wanting. So this is kind of what I was referring to with this, the idea that they were making a sound just to make it work in your living room, knowing your speakers won't be perfect and your turntable won't be perfect. So it's like they sort of went, we're going to beef a few things up here, and the end result will be an entertaining sound in your living room. Again, I'm not saying that they thought that way, but that just seems to be the sound that you get. Now, one thing to really worth noting and pointing out about the vintage sound, you get, I would call it a little bit of a if you looked at the frequency curve, you might call it a lift in the mid bass area. Yeah. What you're never missing, certainly with these two in particular, is what's going on with the bass. Yeah. It's big, it's present, it's fairly tight, it's fairly good. I mean, it's not the ultimate in sophisticated detail, but it's really there. So when you're listening to pop music or rock music, you're never failing to get hold of those rhythms. And that's a very nice thing, I was just listening to this Sony recently. Again, I was surprised, and I just found myself really enjoying it. They say, it's toe tapping. It was toe tapping. At one point, I was going like that. I was actually doing that because it gives you all the rhythm, because it's all there in the bass. It's kind of pushed up a bit, bass and mid bass. So you get hold of these rhythms, and, even if you haven't got the perfect pair of speakers in the perfect room, it kind of forces its way through, and it's nice, and I'm a fussy person with sound, but I would tell you truly which would be my favorite ones here, and I'll get on to this bottom one because this is also very interesting. These two, the Sansui, if anyone knows, I'm a big fan of Sansui and this Sony, which doesn't sound far off this Sansui, actually. I would say a bit more beautiful in the top end, a little bit more tight in the bass, this Sansui. But this Sony, it's a really nice sound. The Marantz, it's a quality item, no doubt about it. I'm not mad about it, only because it can get a very tiny bit edgy. I mean, I actually used this Marantz a few times recently where I was using it as a power amp, and using a different preamp, and that really worked good. This Sony, even though not a sophisticated or, like a high-end thing, it also has pre-power amp separation, so which is a plus, I would say. I mean, I would say that a lot of old gear, you know, when they put all these damn buttons on, because that's what they were doing in the mid-70s to attract people, you know. You see these giant Pioneers and giant Marantz. It's a button festival. It's just as many buttons as they could figure out a use for, or not even, put it in. And, you know, all those buttons are in the preamp section. So they're all slightly, you know, reducing or messing with the signal a bit. So, you know, like modern things, often no balance, no bass or treble, no filters, none of it. That's to make a cleaner path of sound, not interrupt the path with lots of pentometers or resistors. And, you know, this is definitely a true thing. So the point I'm saying is, if you have pre-power separation on your old amp, you might try getting a moderner preamp, or say a valve preamp, or, you know, get a little preamp, or use the preamp of a NAD 3020. That's a really nice preamp, because I would say the power amps are the best bits of these things. I mean, you know, that doesn't have half as many buttons as this. This has got all kinds of things: reverse, stereo, left, right, left. I'm not even sure what these do. They put all the signal to ones. I don't know what it's doing. But anyway, it's got a lot of buttons, you know. It's got, even here, you've got tone for each side, left and right. And that's on the Sony and on the Marantz. So you can boost the bass on the right channel and whatever you want to do on the left channel. So anyway, point being, power amp bit could well be the best part of these things. Okay, let's get on to some downsides, because it's not all good. Or not all this vintage stuff is good. You know, say, okay, well look, this Optonica, I'm not sure how you say it. I'll tell you the truth. You probably haven't heard of this make, or it's not a famous make. And there's a reason for that. And the reason is it has gained no reputation. People aren't after it. And the fact is, it don't quite sound right. Yeah, it's not, you know, I'm sure I've looked inside this, it's got a mammoth transformer. You know, it just wasn't designed and worked on enough to get the sound right. So you find with this, the mid-range has a sort of hint of tinniness. The bass stuff, the bass is big, but it's a little bit one-notey. There's just kind of like indiscrepancies here and there and here and there, and you know, it just adds up to, did not get this sound good. So when you're looking at vintage stuff and you think, well, I haven't heard of Audiotronic much, or no one seems to rate Aiwa amplifiers or Toshiba amplifiers, they don't seem to have a reputation. Well, 90% chance the reason is they didn't sound good. They didn't get that sound quite right. You know, if you looked in here, there's a ton, you know, all the components, you know, but it's just lack of design. I am presuming that lack of desire, really, to make sure that it sounded good. Okay, we'll look at the back of these in a minute. It's quite interesting. So let me just talk about the wider vintage sound and what sounds good. I mean, I'm just going to do this very generally, and I'm sure people will disagree with me, and I'm sure there are things I'm going to miss out. But I'm just sort of focusing on that main area of 70s vintage silver fronted stuff. I'm not talking about Quad, Macintosh, Sugden, good companies doing great things, but not in the mass market thing, and not in the showy, good looking world. So, you know, what you're looking for, you want the thing that looks good and sounds good. And there's not that many of them. So to me, amplifier wise, and this will come as no surprise, you know, the vintage sound, do it like this: Pioneer, Marantz, Yamaha, Sansui, Kenwood, which by the way is Trio. Yeah, Trio is just another name for Kenwood. It was called Trio in England and Kenwood in America, but then I think we started calling, they just became Kenwood. I mean, interesting thing, this Optica Sharp. This is made by Sharp. Again, not a name that you probably associate with great amplifiers or have heard about. And it's good reason, you know, it's good reason. Okay, let's also talk about relationship between amps or receivers, power and speakers. Because the speakers of the vintage world, which is obviously a big part of it, I'm not going to do that in massive detail today, but the speakers then were more sensitive, yeah? They didn't need much driving. So 25 watts on a sort of biggish pair or ordinary pair of vintage speakers, you know, you just would have zero problem. It would feel powerful. It would just feel, because the speakers were sensitive. Now, you know, what went on across time, 70s, 80s, 90s, let's say that, the desire to reduce all distortion, as any engineer would do, you know, to get it down from 0.1 or say 0.05, and now we want it to get to 0.01. You know, it's sort of obvious that from an engineering perspective they would be doing that, and also from a marketing perspective. So both in the world of amplifiers, and the speakers of course distort if they're not well designed, and maybe in certain frequencies things go wrong. The general problem was they tried to destroy, to reduce all distortion to the point where they annihilated the fun, the life, the in the room feel. It just got taken away. It just got squeezed the life out of, you know, by this general push for speakers that aren't going to do anything wrong and amplifiers that aren't distorting at all. Generally speaking, and I'm talking generally here, yeah, you know, just generally in the mass of the middle of the range market, the sounds just got anemic, unalive, unfun, not enjoyable, and the sort of sounds that leave you wanting. So all the sound where you're sort of going, oh, what, you know, I'm not really getting it. I'm not really getting the bass anymore. I'm not feeling it. I can't follow it. I'd rather have, I mean personally, I'd rather have this Sony, say, which isn't the end of the world in sophistication, but it ain't bad, pumping me out some slightly boosted bass that I have no trouble at all getting hold of and following, than something attempting to be extremely accurate, but it's not paying off. The amp is really accurate and the speakers are trying to be really accurate, but once it's actually coming out in your living room, sometimes that would just be, you know, just disappointing, lifeless. Do you get it? I mean, I think I'm explaining. I think that sort of makes, you know, you should get what I'm saying there. And also, you would say a smooth sound, you know, not a spiky sound. These two in particular are smoother, tiny bit spiky here, and in this thing, just getting it a bit wrong. It's just not wanting. I mean, this is massively powerful. I think it's like maybe 60 watts a channel, But worth noting always, these things from the 70s, when they say 13 watts, 25 watts, 38 watts, this one, by modern standards, you might think that isn't much, because a modern 25 watts won't sound like it's got any gusto in it. But these do. And this is just something about statistics and how they measured things. Yeah. The reality is I could get this 25 watts against, say, a modern Cambridge 25 watts, and this will feel like infinitely beefier. This Sony in particular, because that's about 25 watts, will just have loads more welly. And you know, the modern, that's say a modern Cambridge in particular, it'll be nice and polite and detailed and it's not reasonably refined, but it isn't in the room, and I'm not it's not giving me a kick. Have I explained? What I'll do now, I'll take the camera around the back because actually it's quite interesting. Okay, give me a second. So let's have a look in here. Let's start at the top, at the back of this Sansui. If you look at that back plate there, it's quite interesting. You see that 90 watts? You know, that refers to the power consumption, yeah? And it's all fairly ordinary stuff here. If we come down to this Sony, they're all made in Japan. They all say made in Japan. Come down to this Sony, we will see that its power consumption is 330 watts. So that's quite a big jump, to be honest, because it's around double the power. Heat sinks, and then those annoying screw terminals, those are not much fun, I've got to tell you, if you change speakers a lot. And of course here on this Sony we do have pre-power. Change it so you can have a separate preamp or power amp, as you do on this Marantz. Yes, I mean, these press button things are okay, but you can't really get in a fat cable in there, so that's a little bit annoying. There's your pre-power out thing, and here, just to look at this Marantz plate on the back, they are so good at the aesthetics, you know, so good at creating desire. And even that little plate at the back is quite a nice looking thing with multiple different typefaces. Designed in USA, produced in Japan, Chatsworth, California. You know, and if we go down to this Optinica, someone tell me how to say that if you can. So we also see power consumption 500 watts, because this is a more powerful thing. It doesn't have pre-power in and out. This thing was actually taken out of a skip. Gee, this is the truth. And I see exactly the same buttons here as the Marantz has. So I just thought it'd be nice to look at the back of these things, you know. Okay. So to sum it up, the vintage sound, it's big, it's enjoyable. You don't feel like you're missing out on anything. As opposed to certain modern or more modern sounds that are more finessed, more detailed, but kind of smaller. You know, the vintage sound is big, it's robust. You put it on some sensitive speakers, some vintage speakers, and you know, it's good. It's really enjoyable. It's giving you a lot. It's giving you a lot of dynamics too, and scale and punch and impact. You're not sitting there wanting or not sure if you're getting hold of the bass in particular. You know, it just gives it to you. That's probably the best way I can say it. Just going to give it to you. It's not the ultimate word in refined sound, but a lot of it, or certainly some of it, it's a lot better than you might imagine. Do you think 50 years old? Surely great improvements have been made. A lot of the time, things have they've just changed what they've trying to do with sound. They've just changed it. You know, there are things that are 50 years old that are as good as modern things. I mean, these aren't them, but they, exist higher end old stuff that just, makes you think, well, ultimately you can't say everything is better now. You just can't say that, A lot of it, some of it might be, but it's not like a rule. I don't think you can say it's a rule. And, you're also in this world of enjoyability, which doesn't correspond necessarily with technicalness. Some of the distortion figures on here, maybe this Sansui might be like 0.15 or might even be 1, could even be 1. You're not going to hear that distortion unless you turn it up really loud, and then it's going to fall apart really loud. But it's not like you do not hear that distortion. And what that little sort of give in the distortion does is it kind of lets little sounds just become a bit bigger. There's a sort of freedom, a luxurious, slightly boisterous freedom, expressiveness in the vintage sound. You got the picture? Did I make sense? It's hard to talk about this to get it dead right, but anyway, that's what I would say upon this subject. Please like and subscribe. Loads more videos on my channel. If you don't know, go to the channel icon and click that and you'll see playlists of all kinds of other stuff. Okay, thanks. Bye for now.